And welcome to the sixth meeting of the committee in 2020. I'd like to remind members and the public to turn off their mobile phones, and any members using electronic devices to access committee papers should please ensure that they are turned to silent. We have apologies today from Donald Cameron, MSP. Our first agenda item today is the declaration of interests. Can I welcome Beatrice Wishart to the committee? Beatrice has replaced Mike Rumbles, and I'd also like to go on the record to thank Mike Rumbles for his contribution to the work of the committee. And can I now invite Beatrice Wishart to make a declaration of any registrable interests that are relevant to the remit of the committee?
Thank you, Convener, but I have no registrable interests.
Thank you very much, Beatrice. Our next agenda item is evidence on the withdrawal agreement and negotiation of future relationship as part of our Article 50 inquiry. Can I welcome our witnesses today? They are Michael Russell, Cabinet Secretary for Constitution, Europe and External Affairs, and David Barnes, Head of EU Exit Strategy and Negotiations with the Scottish Government. And can I take this opportunity, Cabinet Secretary, to congratulate you on your expanded remit and invite you to make an opening statement.
Thank you very much, Convener. And this is, I think, the first occasion on which I've appeared before this committee, or indeed done anything formal under the new title. And I'm very honoured to take on portfolio responsibility for Europe and External Affairs, and I pay tribute to my long-term predecessor, Fiona Hislop, who had responsibility for more than 10 years for that area and took it on from me just about 11 years ago, so it's good to be back as well. I look forward to working with the committee on these topics, as well as continuing to engage in the other areas in my portfolio. Members are aware that the Scottish Government's preferred compromise, if Brexit was to happen, was to remain in the single market and the customs union. We've argued that case since 2016, and we continue to contend, as all the evidence shows, that anything short of that position will be deeply damaging. Now, that position could theoretically still be achieved, and that's why we have sought to influence the UK Government on the matter and continue to do so through the JMC process. However, the Prime Minister's speech on the 3rd of February, the statement from Michael Gove on the inevitability of friction in trade made on the 10th of February, and Monday's lecture in Brussels by the Chief Negotiator David Frost now make it certain that such an approach is not the one they intend to follow. Indeed, far from it. They are determined, we now know, to tread a much more dangerous, damaging and isolationist path. They intend to seek and to deliver a hard, uncompromising, extreme Brexit, which rejects cooperation and sensible collaboration and instead seeks to retreat into some mythical Empire 2 ideological purity. There is, regrettably, no doubt, Convener, none at all, that they have made that choice. It's a choice that can only lead to an outcome which is at the very best the most basic of free trade agreements. An agreement which, in the words of the former Permanent Secretary at DEXU, Philip Rycroft, will impose regulatory barriers to trade, making it certain, in his words, that the conditions for doing business within the UK and the EU will change. It's not Canada plus, it's not even Canada minus. It's Canada minus minus. Minus zero tariffs and zero quotas unless there is some degree of alignment, something completely ruled out by David Frost. Or even something worse, the Australian-style relationship, according to Tory sources, which is their code for a no deal because there is no EU deal with Australia. A no deal predicted this week by Fabian Zelong, who this committee has taken evidence from, amongst others. So we need to be very clear at this stage now what this will mean. Compared with EU membership, a Canada-style deal will lead to a fall in Scotland's national economic output of £9 billion. An Australian-style deal, or more accurately, a no deal, will lead to a fall of £12.7 billion. Trade, inward investment and productivity will be hit. In 2018, overseas exports of food from Scotland were valued at around £1.6 billion, of which £1.1 billion, about two-thirds, went to countries within the European Union. That will be hit. The end of freedom of movement, particularly if allied to the stringent and ridiculous UK government's new immigration plans, will mean a fall in Scotland's working population. Social care in the NHS will be particularly vulnerable from that fall. In summary, it means a turning away from the idea of mutual cooperation and the shared values that underpin the European Union, and only to make us poorer. Convener, this obvious hardest of hard-line positions is what the UK government has now drawn in the European sand. So the Scottish Government must, in these circumstances, reassess its own position. We will, of course, continue to do all we can to limit the damage. We will continue to try and talk some sense into the UK Government. But we will also now have to prioritise not persuasion, but defence. We'll have to work even harder on securing Scotland's rights and mitigating the negative impacts of Brexit, while seeking every opportunity to give Scotland the right to choose a different and more sensible path. Firstly, as the Scottish Government, we will do all we can to maintain dynamic alignment on environmental and labour standards and close cooperation with the EU. This is in recognition of the positive outcome that EU membership has delivered for Scotland, our objectives for continued alignment with a view to re-accession, and a recognition of what the Scottish people have actually voted for. One of our main tools will be the new Continuity Bill, which will be introduced to the Parliament soon. We'll assert our right to operate in our areas of competence in the closest and most dynamic alignment with the EU that we can secure. I will defend that right vigorously if it is challenged by the UK Government. It is our firm view that the extent to which devolved law aligns itself with the law of the EU should be a decision for this Parliament to take and no one else. We'll also be clear on our priorities. We'll make sure they're emphasised in all our dealings with the UK Government and the EU. To give you some examples, we will press the case for continued full participation in programmes such as Horizon Europe and Erasmus+. We'll seek to secure a good agreement on services, especially around mobility of people and data, which is well beyond the kind of FTA which the UK Government will impose. We will argue for the protection of our exports, particularly those like seafood and red meat, which are especially vulnerable to both tariffs and trade friction, that the Prime Minister remarkably seems to find acceptable. And on internal security, we must put in place replacement arrangements for the tools like the European arrest warrant and access to key EU databases, or our citizens will be less safe. We'll continue to protect Scotland's interests as best we can, but people in Scotland have to be realistic about the extent to which the Brexit ideologues who are in charge of the UK Government strategy are prepared even to listen. We can't leave the people of Scotland under any illusion. The position the UK Government has taken will not only be very damaging, but it's one that they have chosen, and they alone have chosen it. As of today, devolved ministers have been given no chance even to look at, let alone influence, the negotiating mandate. UK ministers can cite plenty of meetings taking place, especially among officials, but there has been no sharing of texts, no role for the devolved governments in deciding the UK position, and no meaningful ministerial discussion. It is, Convener, regrettably obvious that even with the best relationship with in the world with the UK, they would still be hell-bent on a destructive and damaging hard Brexit that they have defined with their aggressive rhetoric and their indelible red lines. No matter what we, or Wales, or Northern Ireland say, in or out of the JMC, that is the stark truth. Now, we will, of course, continue trying to protect Scotland's interests because that's our job. But unless something fundamental changes, the UK now intends to do the hardest of Brexits to us, rather than negotiating the type of Brexit we want with us. And so we will have to stand up for ourselves to stop that happening.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary, and that really is a very bleak prognosis indeed. Can I start by asking you, you made it very clear that the Scottish Government hasn't been involved in any way in having its views feed in to this negotiating position that the UK Government has taken. And you outlined some of the things that you're going to do in terms of Scotland's priorities over the next few weeks. Will you actually be publishing your own set of negotiating priorities for the future relationship negotiations?
We've already published a very substantial amount of material on what those are. If you look at the trade paper, which we published 18 months ago, it's absolutely explicit about what we need to see happen. We've published on a whole range of things. I know the UK Government likes to claim that we and others have not said what we wanted. I think we've published in full 27 documents that indicate very clearly where we are and what we want. My colleague Ivan McKee will have more to say on the trade issues shortly in terms of what our views are. What we need to do is to say to Scottish business and industry and wider Scottish community, we want to help you to find a way to protect you from the worst of this and to ensure that your views are heard, and we'll do so. I am also in the process of meeting with all my colleagues to look at the negotiating priorities within their area, and also the priorities we have to seek a speedy re-accession once Scotland has had the chance to choose. So those things are together. So there will be more material coming into the public domain, but we have already made it clear exactly what we need to have happen, both in the micro sense, but also in the macro sense. And the macro sense is we need a sensible discussion about the legal texts and the documents which inform and are going to inform the negotiating mandate of the UK. We know much, much more about the negotiating mandate of the EU because of the way they've operated than we know about the negotiating mandate of the UK. But it's not just about seeing what they're doing, it's about participating in making sure that we draw it up. And that's where the major weakness now is. We have not seen, the devolved administrations have not seen that material.
Thank you for that. You mentioned our expert witness, Fabian Zulig, and we've been lucky to take up evidence from a number of very expert witnesses, including Anand Menon, and they all talked about how, in terms of trade relationships, it's now right around the world as standard practice for governments to involve what they called sub-state actors. That would include industrial sectors as well as devolved administrations. Is there any understanding, do you think, in the UK government that this is the way that trade negotiations tend to be conducted around the world?
I would say no. And if there is an understanding, it is overcome by an absolute conviction that the sovereignty of the UK Parliament is the most important issue. And that sovereignty, of course, in the mantra of Brexiteers, in terms of control of borders, laws and money, overrides everything. I think there's a very telling example in this, which we've used several times to illustrate the mistake that's being made. I think the lesson that the UK government took from the CETA treaty, the Canadian treaty, was that the difficulty at the very end, if people remember, with the Flemish Parliament, where the Flemish Parliament held up ratification, was an example of how that told you never involve the devolved administrations because you'll only end up with a problem at the end. There is another lesson to learn from the CETA treaty, which is that they only got to the stage of having a comprehensive treaty because the Canadian government made sure that all the Canadian provinces were in the room when negotiation took place on provincial responsibilities. So in other words, the full engagement of Canada at every level led to the treaty. But that's not the lesson the UK government have taken on board. And they have been emboldened in that matter by the election results south of the border. We have a right to ensure that the devolved competencies are spoken for by us. There is, as I repeatedly say in meetings of the JMC, not that I'm sure they're listening, there is no hierarchy of governments in devolution. There is a hierarchy of parliaments. And in these circumstances, we carry the responsibility for a range of subjects. Schedule 5 of the Scotland Act is the document which we should represent in negotiation, and we should have the final say on them. Fishing is a very good example. Although there is a UK-wide interest, the substantive interest, overwhelmingly substantive interest, is a Scottish interest. But, the UK is behaving at the moment as if fishing is a reserved matter. And it's going to be spoken for entirely by the UK. And, of course, they justify that by saying negotiations, international negotiations, are a reserved matter. But, of course, throughout devolution, there's been an understanding that there is no absolute hard line, and that there is a necessity to ensure that devolved administrations are involved in international matters where that is important for devolved functions.
Of course, fishing features in the sequencing set out in the EU's negotiating document, and indeed in the withdrawal agreement itself. Do you have a view on the sequencing?
View on? The
sequencing of the negotiations as laid out by the EU.
Sequencing has been was an issue in the first round in the withdrawal treaty. If you remember right back to the summer of 2016 and the heady days of David Davis, rushing about the continent saying he had lots of friends and these were people who were going to make it fine and the German car manufacturers would sort everything out. In those days, he fought a losing battle on the issue of sequencing, and by losing the sequencing battle, he lost the war, essentially. I think that the UK government is in danger of doing so again, because I think it is desperate to say that fishing is a discrete matter on which it alone will speak for the UK, and it cannot be connected to any other matter. It is alone in believing that, and I think that will be a very major issue. I think also there tends to be, apart from in Scotland, but in the rest of the UK, and particularly in London, belief that fishing in some way is not a vitally important thing and it is dispensable. In reality, and that's an internal view, in reality, in the EU context, it's amongst the most important things that they want to talk about. And they're not going to be fobbed off by UK exceptionalism, and particularly exceptionalism of a third country. And that's another element I'm sure we will come on to. Something very profound changed on the 31st of January, and the attitudes changed, and there is no equity of negotiation. The UK is behaving as if it is an equal negotiating partner with 27 other countries. That is not the case. It is a single third country negotiating with a bloc of 27. And I don't think this understands the implication of that.
And I think in terms of fishing, there will be other members that will want to talk to you about that later in some depth. Before we move on to Claire Baker, can I ask you, you've talked about how you're going to work with Cabinet colleagues to focus on our priorities in terms of the negotiations and how to cope with the eventuality of a hard Brexit. Can I ask, in terms of your new role in Europe, how do you intend to use that new role to advance Scotland's position with the Europeans? Do you have a planned series of visits, for example? Is there going to be a change in approach?
Well, Fiona Hislop had undertaken a great deal of work on this, and we worked very closely together. This is a rationalisation of the arrangement, and obviously, Fiona taking on a new brief has allowed that to happen. But there will be a continuity of approach. I already spend as much time as I can, given the nature of the parliamentary process, in Brussels and elsewhere. I intend to continue to do so. I'm very glad that we have Jenny Gilruth now as the junior minister in this brief, and she will take on a role of talking with and keeping the channels open with the EU27 and more widely too. We have a very effective group of people in Brussels who work on our behalf. Their job actually gets more important now, because they have to make sure that our view is heard and our contacts continue. And of course, there are issues in terms of discussing alignment. We will need to be alert to what is happening. It's harder for a country outside the EU to be fully aware of all the issues that are arising. And alignment will have to be inevitably a selective process, because we simply could not cope with, nor would we wish to cope with the huge demand for alignment in every area. But we will need to have our antennae switched on and be aware of the changes that are taking place and the things we need to do. So there's a big job to be done. But I hope we will be spending as much time as we can talking to our friends and colleagues. And we have many good friends and colleagues in Brussels and around Europe.
And in terms of Scotland's commitment to alignment, how well understood is that in Europe, and what are the implications for Scotland's future there?
I think that those are probably two different issues. In terms of Scotland's future there, it's understood that we wish to move to membership, but of course we have to show that we wish to be independent, first of all, and they understand that. And the UK Constitution is a complex thing, and helping people to understand how that works is quite important. In terms of understanding alignment, there is a recognition that we share values. Alignment isn't an abstract. Alignment is about shared values. Alignment on issues of human rights, of employment rights, of environmental protection is about shared values. It's about doing the same things and agreeing how they should be done. So they understand that. But of course, that does not affect the negotiation between the UK and the EU, because we do not speak for the UK in that matter. So I'm sure they will be glad that we share the values, but I don't think it alters the negotiation.
Thank you very much. Claire Baker.
Thank you, Convener. I first wanted to touch on the political declaration and wondered if the status of the political declaration is that it's not legally binding, separate from the withdrawal agreement. And you gave an analysis at the beginning of the aspect of regulatory alignment, which was initially in the withdrawal agreement and moved to the political declaration, now not seen much substance. Do you think there's anything left in the political declaration that is meaningful and that is the intention of either side to pursue?
I don't think there is anything that isn't expendable as far as the UK government is concerned. I think one of the big fears that exists, you hear it expressed quite often in the EU, is that whatever has been agreed, unless it is tied down and enforceable, is, let me put it as kind, may not happen. And, you know, that fear extends to some of the agreements, for example, on Northern Ireland. There is a fear that, you know, when Brandon Lewis, as a new Northern Ireland Secretary, you know, says things about there being no paperwork and no need for, regulatory activity east-west, you know, he is sending a signal that, in a sense, what has been agreed doesn't really matter, and that would be very worrying indeed. So, no, I don't think in any sense, unless it is in the withdrawal agreement and is enforceable, I don't think it has much validity. There's I think I've said before at this committee, I heard the Taoiseach say at the British Irish Council a couple of years ago something I thought that was an important understanding of what trust is about. He said that trust in the EU between the countries was there because it was enforceable. You know, behind all the working together, there was the ECJ, and what they agreed was enforceable. How do you enforce, anything that Boris Johnson is involved in with the EU? Particularly if many people, in his cabinet and himself, has more than half an eye on not having any sort of agreement at all. I think that it will become a really big issue.
And you've spoken about, with the convener, the way in which the UK government isn't consulting with devolved administrations, and in terms, so there's no partnership working there in terms of looking at future trade deals. What do you think there is in terms of scrutiny when it comes to UK Parliament or this Parliament? It feels that there's very little opportunity for parliamentarians to be involved in any way within this process.
I think we should look, as a Parliament, very closely at a scrutiny role within the intergovernmental review. You know, there is an intergovernmental review taking place. It's been going on for almost 2 years now and has nothing to show for it. And the devolved administrations were expecting at the JMC in Cardiff 3 weeks ago to receive the UK government's proposals on the intergovernmental review, which we were assured were almost there. We've still not seen them. They never happened. But whatever those are, I don't expect them to go anywhere close to what any of the devolved administrations want to see happening. But it would be a start if there was a document on the table from the UK government. If we then start talking about what that looks like, then I do think we need to ensure that the Parliament has a role in there. Now, there's the relationship between the intergovernmental review and the Brexit process is the intergovernmental review will, I believe, give a role to an enhanced JMC process, JMC-EN process, the European negotiations process, which, of course, has a defined remit, though it's not been observed. So I think the Parliament should be able to plug in there. I know there is a frustration, for example, when I write to this committee about having been to the JMC and you see the communique. I mean, the communique tells you nothing. It just tells you who was there. That's actually because there was an attempt early on, the UK government, to make those communiques as if they were an outcome of the meeting. And I think there was some resistance to that from a number of us because they were representing the outcome as being something other than we thought had happened. So you just get it blandly. I think we can actually build on the intergovernmental review to provide a scrutiny role. The UK, I don't think, are looking for an enhanced scrutiny role from the UK Parliament, but we should. And
around the issue of no-deal preparation, so the Scottish Government spent a lot of effort, as did other devolved administrations, in planning for a no-deal. But now, at the introduction, you talked about the increased likelihood of, well, we're not going to achieve frictionless trade. There will be tariffs, there will be checks and balances having to be put in place. What kind of planning is the Scottish Government doing in anticipating although it's unknown, but anticipating the kind of regime we might have to deal with, whether that's in terms of border checks of goods, but also of people, given the immigration announcement this week?
I think there's not going to be significant internal borders for people here in these islands, because the common travel area has existed before the EU, and I think that is pretty well set where it is. But the work we're doing on potential outcomes by the end of this year continues. We've been through 2 processes of preparing for a no deal. The mechanisms have been refined as we've gone through that. There is work that officials are engaged in, working with myself and other members of the Cabinet to take it forward. So we are very mindful that we remain active in assessing what will take place and with our preparations in place. But if there is the type of no deal we're talking about, there will be severe consequences. I mean, just as we said for last March, just as we said for October, it is not a painless outcome.
Obviously, we're going through the budget process at the moment. Is consideration being given to just some of the practical costs that might be involved in terms of infrastructure investment?
It's heavily under review. We had consequentials. We had particularly special funding for a no deal. In my view, didn't cover the costs of it. There's a lot of costs, for example, in staffing and elsewhere, which were not covered by it. But there would have to be continued monies available for it. Some money went to local authorities, both in general, but also specifically for things like phytosanitary inspection and work to be done to see how that would go forward. A lot more of that will be needed.
Thank you. Okay, thank you very much.
Sorry, can I just say on no deal, one of the problems too of a third go at no deal is the ability of the private sector and the willingness of the private sector to respond. Having been twice through a no deal process, there's a lot of scepticism, and stockpiling will be harder to do every time because people's financial flexibility is not there.
Interesting. Beatrice Wishart.
Thank you, Convener. Morning, Cabinet Secretary. You've already alluded to the concerns about fisheries in the negotiations. Could I ask what you'd actually like, what the government would like to see agreed between the EU and the UK government on fisheries?
Yes, we've been pretty clear on where we think that this should go and how it should go. I mean, you represent a significant fishing constituency, but so do I. But it's a different type of fishery. So for a start, you start off, as you well know, by saying there's no homogenous policy on fisheries. There are different sectors and they need to be treated in a different way, and you have to bring in aquaculture to this as well. So there are, we have to have that recognition that exists. We share, what should be the common goal on this, which is long-term conservation, sustainable exploitation. That's the underpinning thing. So anything that is decided has to be decided there. We also recognise a deep dissatisfaction with the CFP as it has been operated. And I think you will know you have to differentiate between the CFP as it has been operated and what the CFP actually is. We have always, speaking politically from my party, talked about local coastal management. But the UK has never talked about that. It has always talked, it's actually resisted doing the type of things. So there can be a negotiated outcome of this that maintains the overall objectives of sustainable fishery, of ecological management, but also accepts that the way in which the CFP has operated is not operated in the interests of many coastal communities. Now then, if you accept those things, then we can have a sensible negotiation on a better outcome for fisheries. But we don't want to mislead people. And, a lot of the rhetoric, as you know, around the sea of opportunity is very misleading indeed. We also should be mindful, and now I go away from your area to my area, we should also be mindful that although I know you've taken evidence that is sceptical about possible advantages for Northern Ireland, the western coastal waters and their closeness to Northern Ireland and to a European market will be significant. And in my view, will be significant on the processing sector and the shellfish sector particularly. So we want to see not the CFP as it is. We want to see a much better management and local management involvement in it. We want to make sure that historic rights are recognised, but also the rights of coastal communities and the rights of the fishing industry. And we want to make sure that the differences in each part of the industry are recognised. The best way to do this is to make sure that Scotland and the Scottish Government and the Scottish Parliament are active players in the negotiations, not on the sidelines.
Okay. And that, I guess that comes on to the sort of the bargaining chip as fisheries being used. So I just wonder what your views are on that. Do you see that as you know, how negotiations can move on with future trade agreements?
I think it's really important that people are told the truth. And you know, we have seen for the last 2.5 years UK ministers only being willing to talk about Brexit in Scotland in the context of fisheries. You know, I mean, to be blunt, Michael Gove has been in Aberdeen and Peterhead Fish Market more often than some people who work there. You know, they go and they have this conversation and they talk about protecting the fishing industry. I think we need some truth in this. If the UK government is really determined not to link this and not to see it linked to anything else, then how are they going to achieve that? How are they going to achieve that when there is such a priority given to this by European countries? There's a negotiated outcome, without a doubt. But the history of the UK government on this, as anybody involved in it knows, is big talk from a UK government and then complete capitulation. And many people look at it and say, is that going to happen again?
And in terms of access to market for Scottish fish exports, how do you view the trade-off between access to waters for EU boats?
Well, I don't think there's an absolute trade-off because the situation here is there are historic rights, which you cannot deny. There needs to be a renegotiation of those, but it's a two-way street. Scottish boats need to land in EU ports too. And there needs, therefore, to be a recognition of interdependency. And that is a recognition that's completely lacking. That there is a complete discrete nature and everything can be managed on the basis. If you look, look at the reality of a coastal state in negotiation and agreement with the EU at Norway, there's an annual round of negotiations. But Norway is more than happy to accept aspects of EU membership which the UK have just torn up. Now, would it be a different set of circumstances, it's difficult to speculate, if Norway, for example, refused to be in the EEA and refused to be part of the single market? Would it be the same type of collaboration? Because that's where the UK is going to be.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Stuart McMillan.
Thank you, Convener. Cabinet Secretary, I just want to go back to the issue of what you were discussing a few moments ago regarding the negotiations and the approach. I think you were quite clear in terms of the comments that you've put on the record thus far this morning. Can you clarify in terms of the Scottish Government's view of the UK Government's bandwidth and what they actually have in the locker to engage and actually have negotiations with the EU? Do you think that there is enough expertise there to actually do that?
Well, I couldn't possibly say because I don't know what resources they're bringing to bear. I mean, my experience of Brexit is they've been bringing to bear vast resources on a policy which can only impoverish the UK, which seems perverse, but they've been doing it. I mean, I don't wish them ill in negotiations, but I wish them good sense in negotiations. And I think the question of capability is directly related to the objectives they have set and the capability they have of achieving those objectives. And I think some of those objectives, I would be sceptical if they could be achieved, no matter how much resource you throw at it. Barnier's response to Frost's lecture was quite interesting. Because Barnier says, well, we understand Canada, but you're not Canada. Because Canada is, over there, and you're here. And there is a big difference in that, proximity. Trade is one of the biggest factors in trade is proximity. And therefore, you're not going to get a Canadian agreement because it's very, very different. But if you spend the entire time negotiating for a Canadian agreement, what happens? There's a bit of a myth, that the UK government peddles all the time. In some sense, what happened at the end of last year, with Johnson's renegotiation, was a triumph. Johnson was elected, came in, took this tough line, the EU capitulated and everything was fine. That is not true. What actually happened, was Johnson got a worse deal than the May deal. They presented it as a better deal, but he only got it because he agreed essentially to a border, an east-west border for Northern Ireland. That's the reality. It's very interesting how in Northern Ireland the May deal is regarded as a better deal than the Johnson deal. So the myth is Boris Johnson's a tough negotiator. He's going to go in there and sort things out. And we're on to round 2 of the myth now, which is Boris Johnson, who has taken charge of these negotiations, got rid of DEXU. Frost reports directly to him, and there's an issue there in ministerial responsibility for the devolved administrations. Because up until now, the DEXU ministers who've been part of the JMC, EN, they are no longer in office. Gove is not responsible for negotiations. So we are in a structure which does not involve directly in our meetings a minister with responsibility, and that is a significant issue. But even taking that aside, the view is the Johnson approach will succeed. Well, it didn't succeed last time. Why it won't succeed this time? But if you spend a lot of time on impossible things, you don't get there. Red lines are also definitive. If you go back, take all the myth out of it, and go back 2.5 years when we first, I think, saw the stepped diagram, which people remember about red lines and their outcomes, going through from EEA right down to what actually happened. That predicted 2.5 years ago the UK red lines would lead to this outcome. And that is the same now. If the red lines hold, if the refusal to align holds, then the outcomes are inevitable. That made that point, and that's where we are at the moment.
What role is the Scottish Government looking to obtain and get involved in, whether internally through the UK structures, but also with the negotiations with the EU to actually put forward the Scottish Government's and Scotland's positions?
We've been discussing in the JMC-EN for actually 2 years now. February 2018 was the first time we talked about it. What role the devolved administration should have in stage 2. And stage 2 was much delayed, but there is on the table a proposal which I made actually, and which has found favour and which could operate. Now, my view is, I want Scotland to have the right to choose, and I want Scotland to re-enter as a member. But whilst we've always taken the position that whilst we're in the UK, we should endeavour to be as constructive as we can be. And the model, very briefly, is what we call a 3-room model. And, it's referred to now as a 3-room model in all the correspondence stuff. But let me just explain it, because it's actually quite simple. The first room is where the devolved administrations and the UK government would put on the table their position on a subject. So if we could take fishing as an example, but there are many other examples. So you go in and you say, this is what we need out of this is what we want. If you are able to get through there by negotiation to a common position, then you're in the second room. And the second room is where the UK negotiating mandate is decided upon. Now, that would require all sides to compromise and all sides to come together and decide what can be done. That's not to say we agree with it, we think it's good, but you could do so. If you can then sign on to the mandate, then the third room is where the negotiation takes place. Now, I have no ambition for the Scottish Government to be in that room, but the parallel would be the former presence at European councils. I've been as a minister in various portfolios at European Council. You very rarely get to speak, and disgraceful how that happened on fisheries, particularly. Where still with Fergus going to these meetings, he's not running it or negotiating in an effective way because he's not allowed to. But there is a parallel of speaking and being involved in them. I've represented the UK at least one European Council for a variety of reasons. So the third room is the negotiation. But I think most of the time the UK is there, but also they're operating on an agreed mandate, which has been agreed by the devolved administration. So that's the model. It requires the UK to accept that there's meaningful negotiation at the first 2 stages. And I don't think there's any such acceptance at the moment.
Have you had any dialogue with the Secretary of State for Scotland to raise your concerns and raise your issues with him?
He has been to the JMC, EN, since his appointment, there have been three JMC ENs, and he has been at 2 of them. Was there one in December? I can't remember.
No, 2 in January, 1 in the autumn.
They're meant to be every month, but for some reason they don't have them every month. So he has been at 2 of those, and he has. I have spoken to him at those meetings. I haven't met him separately on that. Apart from that, I mean, I'm not criticising him. That simply hasn't happened. The important link in this is between the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, Michael Gove, his office, and that has changed. I mean, Oliver Dowden had, as Postmaster General, had responsibility for the Constitution. He's now, the trouble is, a constant changing cast. He is now Culture Secretary, and Chloe Smith is back from maternity leave, and she is back in the Constitution brief. And Dexu up until the 31st of January. What happens now, I don't think we know. And the Territorial Secretaries of State at the Cardiff meeting, Julian Smith was there, who was very effective, I have to say, the Welsh and Scottish secretaries. And in Cardiff, there was also David Frost's number 2, who came to give us a presentation. But Cardiff was also the first meeting in which the Northern Irish had been back, and they were represented by the First Minister and Deputy First Minister. And that was chaired by Mark Drakeford as the Welsh First Minister. I chaired the JMC in Edinburgh in October, which was the first JMC EN on a new round that Gove had tried to establish, which would take place out with London and chaired by devolved ministers when appropriate.
I've got one final question in a different area. I know some colleagues are going to ask some questions regarding border checks. But as you'll be aware, I chair the cross-party group on recreational boating and marine tourism. And there has been an increasing number of visitors coming to Scotland from EU nations, particularly Germany and the Scandinavian countries. Has the issue of border checks come up regarding marinas and potentially putting that type of infrastructure in place?
But I'm happy to take it up if you want to come and talk to me about it, and if people want to let us. I mean, I know I'm always pleased to see and slightly surprised to see in the large number of marinas I have in my constituency flags from other countries and people coming from elsewhere. I'm very happy to look at it, but it hasn't been raised as yet.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Alexander Stewart.
Thank you, Convener. Cabinet Secretary, during this whole entire process, we've been dealing with deadlines continually, it would appear. And Mr Barnier talked about the clock ticking. Well, that clock is still ticking now that we are in this transition period. And when we took evidence recently from Dame Margaret Leslie, she spoke about that there would probably not be one deal, that there'd be a number of deals because the transition period was quite tight to achieve everything that would be required. So can I ask, has the Scottish Government, or does the Scottish Government believe that the transition period should be extended past 2020?
Yes, I mean, the sound of the clock ticking, is the sound of Boris Johnson, because he set the clock, there is no need for the clock to tick on the transition period. It's not indefinite, but, he has accepted the transition period as was discussed by May, but May was talking about it 18 months beforehand. So the transition period has been more than halved. And he, I'm not sure whether he has now repeated his pledge to die in a ditch, but, he is sticking to that period. That is not necessary. There is no FTA of any significance that has been negotiated in that period of time. And that, that precedent is not the absolute example. You could imagine it being done, but I think it is setting a pressure which he imagines will concentrate minds, because he imagines, and I go back to this myth, that that is what he did last year and came out of that initial meeting with the Taoiseach at a hotel in Liverpool, essentially with a triumph. I think he is misinterpreting what took place then, and I think if he thinks that is the precedent, he's making a serious mistake. I think that the transition period could have been much better used, even if you're going to set that tightly, by saying, let us get the closest relationship we can through the single market and customs union membership, even if that was a transitionary phase. transition is not necessarily about just becoming a third country and walking away, which is what he thinks it is. The membership of the EEA and EFTA and EEA was always seen and remains seen as a way into the EU. It is actually probably quite a good way out if you wanted to take it, which would be to hold to regulatory alignment because you are in a single market. Not to do so in fishing and agriculture, of course, which is where the Norwegians are, and to have accepting that would be a process of change. Not necessarily doing it in the customs union, although that offer was there, and then to consider where you go. That would have been a sensible thing to do. In terms of not a single deal, that is an interesting prospect. I think Charles Grant has written on it too. Essentially, the thesis there is that there are a limited number of things you could sort out by the end of the year. Fishing might be one. Security might be another. Security probably is more easily imagined as a solution than, and it's one in which, for example, we've always thought you could get a deal pretty quickly on security. And perhaps one or two other things, maybe data, because data is so vital in going forward. And then the other things you left sort of in limbo, in a type of no deal, about which you said, we've still got to do the work on these. So you say, yes, we've got it's all done, we've got an agreement, but these are the areas which we still have work to do on. It's a sort of refinement of the Swiss model, where you don't have a single agreement, you have a whole host of agreements. Now, the view from the EU has always been that they don't want to replicate the Swiss model, because the Swiss model is complex to operate. It's not ineffective, but it's complex to operate. Whether they would change their view. In my view, the biggest difficulty there is it underestimates the desire of the EU to have this done and dusted. And I think you would only enter into it if you had a trust between the partners that this could be a process which was constructive. If the process appears to be as destructive as it is now, and we had the French minister saying this week that people were going to tear lumps out of each other, I think if you get to the end of the year and you look ahead and all you can see is more lump tearing, I think you get pretty fed up with it.
And as I say, Dame Leslie spoke about that idea of having these different separate deals and you've already alluded to the ones that could be looked at initially. So if that is the case, and we're looking at trying to protect, as you've said in the past, what would the Scottish Government look about trying to create a status quo in that timescale if there are not everything being arranged and put in place to ensure that there is the protection that you've talked about?
One point I should make about the overall thing is, the EU is keen on a single governance mechanism for the future, and a single governance mechanism wouldn't arise naturally out of that because it would be the granularity would be too great. You wouldn't make it work. So let's park that, but it's there. In terms of our perspective, I said at the very opening of what I said today, it would still be possible to go for the single market and the customs union. I mean, I have no confidence of any description that's what's going to happen. But, if you were to say that now, then, and if the UK government was to accept that we wish to align as closely as possible, we could actually very constructively put that together quite quickly, and make some pretty clear decisions about how we wanted to align and what that alignment would look like. If we look at environmental regulation, UK is going in one direction with an environmental bill. We're going to go in a different direction, and we're also going to tie ourselves to a degree of alignment on environmental issues. If that was non-controversial for the UK, and I believe actually that it will be very controversial and they won't want to see us do it, but if they were to be sensible and relaxed about that, we could do that with no great difficulty. It also takes a bit of the friction out. I mean, one of the issues that I have been concerned with in the last 3.5 years is I think that there have been constant opportunities to de-escalate the situation, which have been missed. Not only missed, I mean, specifically rejected. We have not sat in a corner and said, we don't want to be part of this. We don't like it. We want to do our own thing. We want to make sure that people of Scotland have the right to choose. But we have offered ways in which this could be de-escalated. And all they require is a recognition that we're going to do things in a different way. And a very good example arises this week on migration. We have made a series of sensible proposals on migration, which are not supported by mad fringes, but are now supported widely across business and industry in Scotland. And I have heard members of the Conservative Party, I have heard Conservative MSPs support the idea of a devolved migration policy, which operates effectively elsewhere. But rather than de-escalate it, our proposals were rejected not having been read. And then the proposals yesterday were presented as being, I think in the words of Douglas Ross, who is apparently a minister in the Scotland office, Douglas Ross said they were effective for the whole of the UK, including Scotland. That is simply is not true. And if Douglas Ross is not willing to accept my word for it, and I suspect he might not be, go and look at what virtually every organisation was saying yesterday. In language, I have to say that I find unusual in my political experience about what the UK government is doing. So I was put on the record here. I think you could de-escalate this pretty quickly and pretty effectively and quite simply. But it's not being de-escalated.
And the role of Scotland in Europe, and that's been discussed about the offices we have and the footprint you will have, managing some of that during the transition period and further from the transition period. You've alluded to this morning about that things could be de-escalated, things could be enhanced, we could work along those lines. That is a perfect opportunity for these footprints to actually achieve some of that because you're already in making some of your own involvement in that process.
If only the Conservative ministers I was dealing with were as reasonable as you. It may be the kiss of death for your career, but I would commend you to high office because, you're absolutely right. We have, where we have our office in Brussels, in the Place Schumann, is just round the corner from where you've been there, where Ucrep is. There is no reason why on a day-to-day business there cannot be communication, positive communication between them. We have our interests, we'll follow those interests. We have a different political perspective, we have a view of what we want to achieve, but actually we need to have those people working as effectively as possible. And if they're going to, if we're going to move into a period in which there will be an active attempt to frustrate that, which is actually, I don't think unlikely, then that's very, very stupid.
Thank you, Convener.
Thank you very much. Annabel Ewing.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. Picking up on a few of the points about the transition. When Charles Grant, we had evidence from Charles Grant the other week, he suggested that what may happen is that, in fact, there will be an extension, but they won't call it that. It will be in disguise, a sort of secret extension, a de facto extension. If that were to happen, though, presumably, and I hear what you said a moment ago about perhaps reaching agreement in a few areas before the end of this year, but if there were a de facto disguised extension, presumably, therefore, in order for that to take place, the rules of the single market would continue to apply as they do at the moment, and the ECJ has... I'm just not clear then how that would pan out.
I have the greatest respect for Charles, and I think he's, he is immensely knowledgeable about these matters. But I think one of the issues that you need to inject into this from time to time is you need to walk away from your normalcy bias. To assume that the UK government operates on anything other than hardline political ideological principles would be wrong. It is the most politicised government I've ever seen, and it doesn't operate on the basis of other governments often operate, which is we can fudge this at the end. We've seen no fudge. We've seen huge errors, but we've seen no fudge. And the European method, is very often, which is to have creative ambiguity. As you know, you've worked extensively in Brussels, and that creative ambiguity allows people to come to their own conclusion about what is actually happening and how they take. And that's actually, in many cases, very useful. If you look at what has happened, the Good Friday Agreement is a tremendous example of the positive nature of creative ambiguity, where people do not have to come to hard decisions because we accept there are a variety of outcomes. That is not what I see from the UK government. You know, I mean, what Mr Stewart's just been saying, if that was the UK government, we wouldn't be in a really difficult situation we're in terms of relationships. So I don't think in the end they will do that, but I might be wrong. They might be forced into that position, that they will do so. I cannot see them accepting ECJ judgments. You know, there has been from the beginning of this certain things which, unless you actually go and have these conversations, you don't realise how deeply they're held. There's an absolute anathema on a European court. Although it's utterly irrational. You know, there is no evidence the European Court has done anything other than be fair. If people have the chance to read it, I would commend Ian Forrester's fantastic closing lecture in the European Court 2 weeks ago. It is a very moving, very, very important statement. And you know, he is very clear that there's just, you know, the European Court has been scrupulous, fair and positive, and the UK has benefited from it. So there's an anathema there. Migration too. I mean, you know, yesterday's announcement was, in normal times, just unbelievable. You know, because it's utterly counterproductive. The one thing we've seen this week that makes me think that there's a sort of development of a philosophy around this is Frost's lecture. Frost attempted to put a sort of philosophical and intellectual gloss on what is happening, lent heavily on Burke, you know, and more or less what Frost was saying was, look, we know that this will be difficult or damaging for 10, 15 years, but out of it will come this new age, you know. So what we do is we take the pain, all this happens, and suddenly we are back in, Gloriana is reborn, we're back in this period. I think that is incredibly foolish. You know, I think one of the questions that somebody should have asked him at the end of the lecture is, how would Burke have dealt with climate change? You know, there is a need to adapt the philosophies of the 18th century, you know, to the current reality, and that's nowhere in the lecture. The lecture is also worth reading on the basis that Mr. Frost seems very keen on the independence of small countries, you know, profoundly keen on it, and that's very helpful. And he will hear me quoting some of his remarks in the future. So my view of this is not positive, and I can understand where Charles is coming from. I'm very sceptical.
Well, I hear what you say, and it is interesting that all the things that we thought could never happen and arguments being put forward, particularly by the UK government, that we thought we would never see, we have seen. So we have passed the Rubicon a long time ago on this issue, and therefore Charles's experience of Brussels is rooted in what would be rational, and as opposed to looking at the irrationality that we're looking at. In terms of the issue that you referred to, Cabinet Secretary, about goodwill, I mean, on the key issue of alignment and level playing field, it seems that the sabre-rattling continues on the part of the UK Prime Minister, but presumably for the EU27 that is just a deal-breaker, and there would be no, if there's no movement on that as a matter of political positioning, the EU27 would have to just accept that there would be no deal, because that's the way the UK government seems to be.
It's very hard. I mean, there have been a number of themes that have run through the negotiations from the very beginning. One of the most powerful has been the integrity of the single market. You know, that cannot be threatened. You know, if you accept that you would have a competitor on your doorstep who is not going to abide by those, but expects trade favours and expects access, but won't abide by your rules, I don't see it happening. I mean, you know, it would be a major change of position from the EU, from everything that has ever happened. And the UK has been wrong about this in the past. You know, the UK's, Johnson's view of the influence of Prosecco manufacturers, you know, the view of Davis's view of BMW manufacturers, all turned out to be, if I may use the term, mince. Yeah, and I think we're just going back into that situation. I would just take issue with the word sabre-rattling. Sabre-rattling implies that in the end you don't use the sabre. I don't think it's sabre-rattling. I don't think they intend to have that alignment. I think that ideological purity is such that they will not accept it. And that is, if not a deal breaker, and if Charles were to be right, and it would lead to a number of mini non-deals which could be dealt with, the economic impact, I mean, I've quoted the figures here again today. The economic impact is not in doubt. You know, this is, you know, the estimates might be $1 billion out one way or the other, But there is no doubt that the damage would be done, severe damage would be done, and it would be long-lasting. You know, we are talking about a situation that will be bad for a long period of time. We have had more than a decade of austerity. We are talking about things getting worse for, you know, that period and more. What does that look like if we are 15 years down the road from now, and we have had 25, 26, 27 years of austerity and decline, and we are also facing, as we are facing, a climate emergency? What does that look like for the people of Scotland who we represent? And how could we countenance actions that would allow that to happen?
Looks pretty grim to me. One last question, if I may, Convener. The Cabinet Secretary mentioned in his opening remarks the intention to proceed with alignment as far as the areas of the competence of this Parliament are concerned, and that he would vigorously reject any UK challenge. Is the Cabinet Secretary expecting a challenge? Has he had any indication from the UK government thus far?
I am always prepared. You know, I mean, you know, we have the continuity bill which we passed. The Supreme Court found was within competence, with the exception of one very small part. You know, if you read the judgment, you know, as opposed to some of Mr. Stewart's colleagues talking about the judgment, if you read the judgment, that's what it is. The bits that then fell out of competence did so because the UK government changed the law after we had passed our bill, you know, which was a very sneaky thing to do, so they did. But we have taken and read very carefully, again and again, the judgment. Anything that we put forward will be based upon absolute, clear competence. And, you know, in those circumstances, I cannot imagine that any challenge would be successful. But I think it right to say that we would resist any challenge, and that's what we will do.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. If I could just pick up on this issue of alignment, Cabinet Secretary, you suggested earlier on that the Scottish Government cannot align with the EU in every area. In fact, I think that's how I picked you up. Can you say more about what that would mean and how the Scottish Government would prioritise the areas to align with?
Yes, I mean, I think we have to be, again, realistic about this. You know, alignment, the best alignment is membership. So, you know, if we were, as I hope we will be in membership, then we will align because, you know, we will be part of the single market customs union. And indeed, the alignment would, you know, would grow and develop through an association agreement to start with while your membership was, as happens. So, you know, that's the best way to do it. If you're doing it as a third country, there are issues and difficulties. One of them is simply the constant flow of material. You know, I remember talking to the Norwegian Environment Minister when I was Environment Minister 12 years ago, you know, and she said one of the difficulties they had was they were constantly upgrading and changing their environmental law because, you know, they were not part of the EU, but they were obliged to do so because of their position in the EEA. So I don't think we would be capable of aligning on every single thing. I think that would be an onerous burden for us to do if we weren't in full membership. But we should be able to say, in key areas, we better do this, either because it's more convenient to do it or because we believe it is the right thing to do. And let me give you two examples. On the issue of it is more convenient to do it, the present system of recognising fish disease in aquaculture and taking precautions because of it is based upon European law in which new diseases, when accepted and notified, are put into law automatically. We would have to have a constant process of primary legislation to do that every time the European law was changed. We should align with that. So every time there is a new notifiable fish disease in aquaculture, we would be changing our regulation automatically to take account of it. So that's a sensible, practical thing to do. On the principle side, you could say, you know, we believe that in issues of employment, employment law is of course reserved, but in issues of human rights that we can legislate on, in issues of environmental regulation that we can, then we want to be aligned with this because these are of the highest standards and are continuing to improve. And in those circumstances, we should align well with it. You can then extend that a bit further and look at things like the digital single market. and say we wouldn't want to be cut out of that. Now, we can't be part of it formally until we're a member, but we might be able to continue to develop our law and regulation in parallel with the EU that would essentially make the interchange easier.
How does that interact with common frameworks?
Oh, well, I think if we're going to get on frameworks, we'll be here for a long time. The frameworks issue has become, in recent weeks, very difficult. It's the one area in which we've been able to make reasonable progress. I pay tribute to the officials on all sides who work very hard on it. But a really important issue has now arisen, which I raised in October at the JMC, and I was told by the UK government it wasn't a problem. I think it has now become a significant problem, and it's this. There are two threats to frameworks now. One of them is exactly on the issue of alignment. If we want to align, and say London or Wales doesn't want to align, how do we participate in that? Now, for our point of view, it works perfectly well because we can continue to develop. Remember, a framework is a way of trying to continue to operate issues which were part of EU competence, which are now in shared competence. Now, our approach to that in some areas will be to say, well, actually, this worked pretty well, and therefore we just want to keep up with it. If we don't do so, there's going to be a mismatch. But there's also a more important issue, more fundamental issue, which is where does this leave frameworks with the Northern Irish Protocol? Because if Northern Ireland is aligning with single market rules, but is part of a framework in which we are not so aligned, what happens? Do we continue? I'd be quite happy to continue to align with Northern Ireland and the rest of you, but the UK won't do that. So I think there are some really profound underpinning questions. Now, the five-stage process, you've been involved in the frameworks activity, the five-stage process. One of the frameworks is now at stage 4. I think it's a hazardous substances one.
The first one.
I'd have to confirm that with you. But the others, moving the others forward through the process, I think has to take account of these two difficulties now.
Okay, thank you very much. Ross Greer.
Thank you, Convener. Excuse me, Morning Cabinet Secretary. I'd like to turn back to the excuse me, the Irish protocol. The last time we spoke with yourself, we had far less detail on how that would operate. But clearly, even with further detail, there's still a level of disagreement of who is or is not the most advantaged or disadvantaged by the implementation of that protocol. So I was wondering first, does the Scottish Government have any updated economic impact assessments that you've done or that you've commissioned?
No. We've of course done work, and we've talked about that work, but it is very difficult to do so because I know from the evidence that you've taken, the exact details of how this operates and what it looks like is still. I did like David Henig's, Colin Murray's view that it was the centre of a very complicated and convoluted Venn diagram. I think that's exactly correct. But the trouble with that Venn diagram is there are also big parts of it which are sort of heavily shaded at the moment, and we haven't got the clarity of how they work. So we don't know. Interestingly, the UK doesn't know either. One of the problems I think that's beginning to emerge is a frustration in Northern Ireland, which is being talked about, that the UK doesn't understand the protocol and isn't working in a way that recognises the protocol. I mean, I thought the evidence to the House of Lords Committee was very, very interesting, because what they were, those who've studied this were saying, this is incredibly complicated for ministers and civil servants to operate, and the present there isn't the detail of how it operates. So we'll wait and see. But it's going to be profound. I don't actually agree with some of the evidence. I think there is a threat to the Scottish fishing industry. I also think it will advantage Northern Ireland, and I want Northern Ireland to do well, but I think it will advantage Northern Ireland over Scotland, and that creates problems.
Point of clarity and the lack thereof, and the need for the UK government to clarify what it believes. There's still an issue of certain UK government ministers, Michael Gove I think being the most obvious example, saying there will be some kind of check. Others, including the Northern Irish Secretary and the Prime Minister and his spokespeople, still insisting there will not be any kind of checks. In terms of any discussions that the Scottish Government have had with them, what has been the UK government's line to yourselves about checks, whether or not they will exist?
The line to us has always been there will not be checks, right? But that's not what the EU is saying. It's not what some ministers have been saying. There will have to be some sort of checks. I just don't imagine it can be done without. The nature of those checks and what that means in terms of free flow is one issue. The way in which those checks are regarded by parts of the community in Northern Ireland is another issue. But it goes back to the point I made to Beatrice Wishart, I made early on. You've got to be straight with people. Maybe the best thing for them to say is we don't know. No, it doesn't sound very convincing, but we don't know what will happen. But if you get two contradictory messages, the intention of that is to mislead. It is to confuse. It is to make people feel that they're okay about it. I mean, the clip with Johnson saying to Northern Irish businessmen, on a visit to Northern Ireland, if anybody says that, just send them to me. Well, there's not much point in going to him, because he doesn't know. So I don't think there is any doubt that there will be checks. The nature of them is the question.
Yeah, almost undoubtedly, if checks are required, which I agree with you, they will be, checks in and of themselves require infrastructure, and someone needs to pay for that. What's the Scottish Government's position on who would need to foot the bill for infrastructure required, particularly on the West Coast? There would be infrastructure required at the likes of Aberdeen, Rosyth, etc. But we're going to have a really acute issue on the West Coast. What's the Government's position on who pays?
Our position is, as it was from day one of Brexit, there should be no financial detriment to the Scottish Government or to any part of the public sector in Scotland. There should be no financial detriment, so it must be paid for by somebody else. It must be paid for by the UK. There's a real irony in this, of course. I mean, the UK government spends a lot of time talking about independence and they mustn't have borders. This is Boris Johnson erecting borders, and deliberately, because you could do it without. There's a very, very easy, Mr. Stewart has indicated, so clearly within the Conservative Party, there's a knowledge that you could do this without the borders, but the border, it would be erected by them.
The issue of timescale is going to become an increasingly pressing one. If the UK government hold out their current ambiguity as a position over whether or not checks are required, whether or not infrastructure is then required, who then pays for that, the timescale in which infrastructure can actually be delivered to make checks possible starts to pretty rapidly diminish. Does the Scottish Government have a position on the point at which it is simply no longer viable to have anything adequate in place for the end of the current transition period?
Well, it's pretty tight at the moment.
Yeah.
I mean, it depends what is required, but nobody has had that discussion with us because they are denying anything is required. I suppose the first moment you have to accept that something's needed, then you can begin to plan to put it in place. Until you accept something's needed, there's no possibility of moving forward at all, and that's presently where we are. I mean, that's not just true about this. I mean, if you look at the migration stuff yesterday, the view is that this will start to come into effect on the 1st of January 2021. That's extraordinary. I mean, everybody would have to change all the arrangements they're making. Everybody would have to change their plans within a period of what will be 10 months. And if there is no extension, and of course the only opportunity to extend in law, I mean, there are obviously political issues that could come into play. The only opportunity to extend would be by this summer. It all just seems more uncertainty. I mean, you may or may not remember, because nobody wants to talk about it now, but the UK Tories did win an election south of the border, not north of the border, which they haven't won an election for 50 years, but they did win elections south of the border on the slogan, "Get Brexit done." Brexit is not done. It is not half done. It is not quarter done. But pretending it's done is pretty damaging.
Accepting the difficulty of this because of the ambiguity, because of everything we've just discussed, have the Scottish Government done any scenario planning based on what understanding you have of the protocol, what checks might be required and thus what infrastructure might be required? Have you done any scenario planning on what that would mean? Obviously, there would then be a dispute over who pays for the installation of infrastructure, how that would happen, etc. But with what you can do, even if it is as simple as supporting businesses to understand what might be about to happen, what infrastructure might come into place, what scenario planning have you done there?
I mean, we have a readiness process. We have work that takes place on readiness. So we don't publish everything we do, quite really. That would be wrong to do so. But we always have these in place. In addition, last year, in the run-up to October, John Swinney published a document, in his role as the chair of readiness, of SCORE, of the emergency preparations, and he talked, for example, about arrangements at Stranraer and what might be needed in the short term. He was then He was then roundly condemned, if I remember correctly, by the Member of the Parliament for Stranraer, one Alistair Jack, who said it was disgraceful that such things were going to happen, although, of course, as a Brexiteer, he had made them happen. So you have to deal with that level of unreality too. But we will continue to prepare as best we can and consider all options. But we need to know the truth of the matter, and as there is a denial of truth at the moment, it's difficult.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Kenneth, did you want to come in?
Yes, indeed. Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. In your opening statement, you mentioned the need to access European crime databases and also continuation of the European arrest warrant. I'm just wondering what would be the impact on the ability of the police and security services to tackle international crime, particularly organised crime and jihadist terrorism, if agreement wasn't reached in these areas?
I've met with, along with the Cabinet Secretary, I've met with Europol. We've had discussions about issues here. I've met with the police to discuss these issues. There is very considerable worry, as you know, about a number of legal issues. There's a worry about the European arrest warrant, the inadequacy of arrangements were the European arrest warrant not to be available, then the inadequacy of arrangements, because you would be reverting to, Scotland would be reverting to extradition processes which other countries have given up. So it's not a question of just going back to what was the belt and braces position beforehand. You're going back to a situation which others have stopped operating, so it all becomes very complex, and you've got a very good tool there. So we've been very keen to make sure that that didn't happen. So far, we've made representations, we've had discussions, and we'll continue to do so. We see no concrete proposals. But I don't want to be totally negative on it, because as I said also earlier, security, which includes organised crime and issues of justice and keeping citizens safe, is an area where I think agreement could be found moderately quickly. The UK Commissioner, whose name escapes me now, the last UK Commissioner, Julian King, who was a security Commissioner and Justice and Law and Order Commissioner, was very positive in his approach to Scotland and an approach to making sure that everybody was working together. And although he's no longer in office, I think a lot of the work he did in preparation will turn out to be useful. But it's not resolved, and if it's not resolved by the end of the year, then we are going to see our citizens less safe than they would otherwise be.
Yes, I mean, I think that's fairly obvious, I would have thought. I mean, I understand, for example, that, Germany won't allow extradition to non-EU countries, for example. So that's just one example of where there could be difficulties, but there are obviously many, many more. I mean, you said that you thought it could be solved relatively quickly. Is in discussions with the UK government, which I take it you're having on this particular issue, have they indicated any potential timescale for resolving these matters before, for example, the 31st of December?
Current round, I wouldn't say that we have had those detailed discussions. I would say that they are aware of our position. I don't think that they've indicated their position particularly clearly on it. They're aware of our position. I'm only saying that in a scale of difficulty, this is not at the most difficult end. The UK government would have to want this to work. And you're right about the extradition issues. There are countries beginning to be seen. There's been an Irish case, I think, too, of people appealing against extradition on the grounds that the arrangements are falling to pieces, the European system is not operating, and courts will have some sympathy with that.
Perhaps you could look into the mind of the Prime Minister for a brief moment. And is there any possible reason why the UK government would not want to come to an agreement on this? Would it simply be bloody mindedness? Because it is probably, as you said, one of the things that would have thought would be relatively easy to solve, and indeed it is clearly of beneficial to people in the UK and indeed Europe in terms of our shared interests.
No, and I think I can't look into the mind of the Prime Minister, nor would I want to. But in terms of where they would want to go as a government, it would seem very perverse not to want to start to clear off things that could be cleared off. There are many things I've indicated to you which I think would be very difficult to clear off. but it'd be best to go for the low-hanging fruit, and this is one of them. But the trouble is we don't understand what precisely they are up to, because we are reluctant to believe that hardline ideology that cuts your nose off to spite your face is really a motivation for politics. But that would appear to be the case.
Okay, thanks very much. Thank you. Thanks, Camilla.
Thank you very much. We have some supplementaries. Stuart McMillan.
Thank you, Convener. Cabinet Secretary, in your opening comments, you touched upon the strategy moving from persuasion to defence. Could you provide some more details regarding the main planks of this strategy with regards to, in particular, IGR, and also using devolved competences to mitigate any adverse effects of Brexit? In effect, which devolved levers will you want to use?
Well, I mean, I've indicated that the keeping pace powers, which we want in the continuity bill, are an important part of this. The Parliament already approved them. They'll be getting the chance to look at them again and to look at them as they develop. So that clearly will be a major factor. We will, as I've indicated in terms of discussing through the JMC process, we will indicate very clearly what our views and lines are, what we need to have out of negotiations. Whilst we're always willing to negotiate and to discuss, it is very important that we emphasise our priorities and the things we need. Quite clearly in areas like migration, where they have indicated the hardest of hard lines, we will continue to pursue our view that there is a different approach possible and seek to bring people round it. And we will, of course, continue very vigorously to point to the mandate that we have to give Scotland a right to choose as part of this package. So that's all together in the strategy we're going forward. I want there to be a movement on this which does three things. One is it accepts the reality of the mandates. I have clearly accepted, publicly accepted, that the UK government has the right to take the UK out of the EU based on the election result they had last year. I regret it, but that's the fact. But we have the right to hold a referendum because the people of Scotland have indicated they do not wish to leave the EU and have supported that position in an election, very clearly, in several elections, but certainly very clearly last year. So mutual recognition of mandate is point one. And if you can't accept mutual recognition of mandate, you're not a Democrat. The second point to say is, whilst, therefore, if that happened, whilst the process of UK withdrawal was going ahead, the UK should be mindful of the devolved competences and should accept that the right to represent those competences constitutionally lies with this government and this Parliament, and that it should be exercised in a way collaboratively with them. And the third part of this would be to say that if those things happened, then the type of de-escalation which Mr. Stewart has indicated is possible, and I agree is possible, would be beneficial to both sides as we pursued Scotland's right to choose and as we made sure that our position was represented. That would seem to me a pretty clear way to go ahead. And it does not compromise anybody's hard-won or deeply held position. It would not compromise the UK government's desire to leave the EU. It would not compromise the Scottish government's desire and wish to give the people of Scotland the right to choose, and it would not compromise the work that we could do to protect Scotland's interests. That would be win-win.
No, thank you.
Thank you very much. Claire Baker.
Thank you, Convener. I just want to ask about EU citizens and settled status, if you're able to give an update on the situation in Scotland in terms of those who are applying for settled status, if that's possible. And also, your understanding of the UK government's current position of what happens to EU citizens when the transition period ends, because it seems to have moved around a bit.
We can send you the latest figures. They were published last week, I think. We have an update figure. That is continuing. People are continuing to apply. It's clear to me that some people will not apply or don't want to apply, whether that is a hardline position they've held, and I understand it, but I don't think it's sensible to do anything other than apply if you can, or whether people who are going to leave, and have already decided to leave and therefore they're not applying for it. My worry has primarily been those people are getting pre-settled status when they should get settled status. This is an area, of course, that Ben Macpherson speaks on, and I'm sure he will want to respond to you in that regard. In terms of what happens thereafter, the UK has indicated that the period in which you can apply ends, is it next 3 months after the end of the... I think it's 3 months after the end of transition. Again, Ben would confirm the details with you. We would stand very firmly beside and alongside those who have settled status, who have a legal right to remain if anything was done otherwise. And of course, we are hoping this afternoon to extend voting rights and candidacy rights to those people, and to make sure that they are fully part of our system. Those with pre-settled status who have got it wrongly should have their position clarified. Those who have not applied, we believe they should apply, and we would encourage them to do so.
Thank you. We'll follow this up with Ben Macpherson, who's the...
And gives you the updated figures and a clear answer on the issues you've raised.
Okay, thank you very much. As you know, Cabinet Secretary, this committee conducted an inquiry into the Erasmus Plus programme directly as a result of approaches from young people in Edinburgh, and we wrote to the government saying that we believe that everything should be done in order to maintain the Erasmus programme. You started in your opening remarks where you said that it was the government's preference to maintain access to EU programmes like Erasmus Plus and Horizon. How will you go about doing that, if not through a persuasion strategy with the UK government?
I mean, quite clearly we continue to contend that it is in Scotland's and everybody's interest to remain in membership, and we have been critical, as you know, of the value for money exercise that was conducted, which we believe was not done in a way that reflected reality. We will, of course, continue, and I think Richard Lockhead has indicated this publicly, we'll continue to consider ways in which we could remain part of the programme, even if the UK didn't. I'm not in a position to say where that is at the moment, but quite clearly that would be something we would want to do. There are, of course, cost implications for all of these things, but we will want to make sure that we consider that very seriously.
I take it if you did want to explore the possibility of a devolved or sub-state associate membership of these programmes, it is contingent on the UK government giving permission for Scotland to do that. Is that correct?
I believe that would probably be the case. I think in most, maybe not in all of these circumstances, that would be the case. It may be the case in Erasmus Plus. I understand. We will find that out and let you know. But the issues around that would be the issue of the UK's position. There would also be the position of, presently that is dealt with in financial terms through the subvention that goes from the UK to the EU. Would they divert the cost of that to us so that we could pay for that? Essentially it would be a no detriment approach. We would have to see whether that took place.
Thank you. And just to finish up by looking ahead, I spoke to you about your new role and how the Scottish Government proposes to work with EU institutions in the future. What outcomes are you seeking to achieve through these bilateral engagements with Member States and with the EU? And can you say any more about what role the Scottish Government's office in Brussels will now take?
Well, quite clearly, whatever our constitutional position would be, quite clearly the EU will continue to be of enormous importance and influence to us. Even that's part of the stupidity of Brexit. On our doorstep will be one of the world's largest trading blocs, but much more than a trading bloc. A bloc that has shared common values and the objectives of improving the lives of its citizens in a particular way for which we have strong empathy. So we would want to make sure that our engagement is positive and continues. That is also true in terms of many of our businesses. It is vital that we continue to have our presence there and that presence there is productive for us. So we have a big role to fulfill there. Of course, we also want to make sure that there is an understanding of the EU of our empathy and our desire not to be uncritical in our relationship, but to work through that relationship to full independent membership, and that's the objective the government is quite open about. So we have short-term goals, which is to make sure that we continue to benefit from it, medium-term goals, which is to continue to build our relationship, and slightly longer-term goals, though I don't think it's that far away, of entering as a full member.
Thank you very much. Now, I'm used as a convener to racing against the clock in this committee and telling witnesses and members to keep their questions succinct, but we've covered a wide range of areas and we are actually finishing ahead of time. So unless there's anything else you would like to add, Cabinet Secretary, I would propose to move to private session.
I'm grateful for it being a useful and productive discussion. I look forward, considering roles I have, to sitting with you and talking with you and working with you, and of course I am very open to discussion with you collectively and individually, and look forward to that.
Thank you very much. We'll